Hi, how are you? Welcome back to AP Human Geography. We're transitioning into some new reviews today, so we're super excited that you're joining us. Give me a second to transfer my screen for you. Again, I still don't know why I'm not quicker at this. But again, we're AP Human Geography, and you're with me, Mrs. Brandt. Yesterday you're with Miss Lindsley, and she was finishing up taking a look at the political unit. You can see the Slido that we're going to use here on this screen today. I will pause for a second. Little shout out to my senior board. So I'm in charge of, I'm the sponsor for senior board at Glenbard West High School. And today we were talking about some things we could do for seniors. We found out in Illinois we will not be returning to school. And so I did ask them for a little help in my corny little intro, and this is what they said. They've been watching a lot of The Office lately. And so Michael Scott was speaking to them, and they thought I should do this. So this is a shout out for my senior board. I am not superstitious, but I am a super human geography teacher. I think I'm supposed to say, but I am a little stitious. So either way, best of luck to the class of 2020 all across the country, all across the globe, as we're trying to find ways to celebrate all the great things you've done as well. So yesterday, Miss Lindsley left you with these 4 items to practice, these AP practice questions tied to the political unit. And so I'm going to go through some of the ideas. As you're filling out the Slido, if you notice I did not put it on this one, we are going to kind of start building some AP stuff into our daily lessons. So if you don't get everything right now, don't panic. We're also starting to build in some practice time. We're going to get there. Right now, I need you focusing on the connections. Were you able to at least get some of those ideas? And that is where we really want us to start. So the first one, using an example, explain how supranational organizations can promote economic development. So when we're talking here, I think some things that we've talked about in the past too, you could talk about the EU and how the use of a common currency helped to lift up some of those countries that were maybe struggling on the Eastern Bloc and kind of balance out some of the finances there. You could talk about NAFTA and the free trade agreement. And so I understand it is no longer called that, but you're not going to be penalized. But that idea of the movement of goods from Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and that idea of helping to bring more money into Mexico and improve their development as well. Or how about even OPEC, setting the standard prices for oil producing exporting countries. That idea of setting those prices is so that we're not undercutting other people, and so that we're kind of leveling the playing field and giving all players opportunities for success there as well. Number 2, explain how lack of development can lead to a failed state. At the end of the day, when we start talking about development, the first thing is you're going to touch on probably finances. It's difficult for a state to progress if you don't have money to invest. Go back to Human Development Index. If you do not have money to invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure. And so that lack of development makes it really difficult then to progress and move forward if you're not able to invest in those things. Number 3, describe how each of the following forces contribute to devolutionary pressures within a country. So remember, devolutionary, putting pressures on wanting more voice. And this is prior to separation, but this is that idea of wanting more voice. And so that idea of cultural diversity, so things that are going to put some pressure there could be variety of languages, variety of religion, that history. Regional economic differences, some of that unequal distribution of wealth, the uneven distribution, I would say, of resources as well. And so one area benefiting more than another area, or the physical geography and territorial size. When we're talking about that, we could be talking just about smaller regions versus bigger regions. Think about even within our own country, the size of Alaska compared to the rest of the United States. Or we think about resources, these areas that have, like, look, I'm carrying the weight of all of the entire country. I deserve more voice. Or lack of resources. Distance between the core or the periphery areas too could be something that could contribute to devolutionary pressures. In number 4, I'm not going to lie, I'm going to turn and look a little bit. Miss Lindsley was kind enough to share some notes with me. And so when I'm looking at her notes, so identify and explain one political impact resulting from devolutionary pressures related to cultural differences in either Spain or Nigeria. So I'm going to start with Spain. So if we're talking about the identify, you might identify this idea of factors of secession or division. So that would be the identify. Then if I was explaining, you would talk about full separation, so the ability to communicate in their own language. So if we're talking the Basque or in their schools or in their government, you might talk about this idea of people's own history, political system, national heritage, in other words, their holidays or festivals. That idea of to reunify a country that is divided between Spain and a neighboring country, or that armed conflict that means for political change. So those are things that could lead to secession. And so, you know, especially some issues that necessarily Spain has been dealing with. In Spain as well, you could also identify factors of autonomy, so that there is limited autonomy, limited self-determination. And so we see this in these areas that want increased control. We saw that in Catalonia, you see it in those regions where their language is reducing tensions within the majority. Maybe they could allow for a dual culture or dual society that embraces those things. And then a third thing you could identify with Spain are factors of unification. And so this could be that it's a Spanish state. And so using the EU, so that idea of currently functions as a multi-society, you could talk about the Spanish military or police forces used in response to regional votes. You could talk about Spanish nationalism being promoted by the central government. Spain faces challenges to political unity due to internal cultural factions as well. What I will tell you, because some of you are probably going, how am I going to remember all of that? Give examples. I'm sure your teachers talked about either Catalonia or the Basque. So talk about those and just keep giving those examples and explanations, and you're going to probably touch on some of those ideas. Now, if you're like, my teacher didn't talk about that at all, then they probably might talked about something even not Nigeria, other areas in Nigeria. So if you were using Nigeria, you could again identify an impact, so factors of secession again, but here maybe you talked about religious differences, or you talk about ethnic tribal differences. You could talk about conflict, maybe the Boko Haram or some of the Islamic movements that were occurring in that area and putting pressure of secession on that region. So even if you didn't remember exactly those areas, I mean, even in the political unit that Ms. Lindsley and I were just talking about, we showed you all those different ethnic borders and lines. Factors for autonomy. So we could talk about the acceptance of many cultures and how that can also cause people to embrace one another. Government allowing for multiple legal systems, like the English common law, tribal or customary legal systems. So maybe there's multiple systems going on at the same time. And then also maybe some linguistic differences that have actually led to some social movements that's allowing for more autonomy. Or you could look for factors of unification, so that would be your identify. And then our explain could be something such as maybe the movement of the capital to help bridge the cultural divide, or Nigerian federal state allows for more ethno-national political representation, or Nigerian nationalism is promoted by the central government. So these are things that would then bring people together. So those are things to start considering. Again, if you haven't logged into my AP Classroom, we've got that link in our description. Great place to practice. They're releasing more questions for you guys to continue to practice with as we're preparing for that AP exam on May 12th. And so the time stuff is coming. We're going to practice that. But I do want to pause and have you look that we are going to ask you to really describe, explain, compare geographic concepts. When we see the word apply, what we mean is really talking about applying your knowledge. You've learned so much over the course of the year that we want to see what you've learned. I keep telling my students, write, and when you think you're done, add another sentence. So today we are totally shifting. So we have been focused on some new content, and then we focused on kind of reviewing the 5 big units. So for the next 5 days, what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at specific skills. And we're going to look at skill category 1 today. So we're going to focus on concepts and processes. So we're going to analyze geographic theories, approaches, concepts, processes, or models in theoretical and applied contexts. But what that really means is we're going to look at where this theme shows up in 3 different units, okay? Sorry, my math is bad, 4 different units. But this is where College Board has said, we see these ideas continuously developing. So if you notice, you're going to say, Mrs. Brandt, didn't we just talk about political boundaries on Friday? Well, yes, we did. But again, now it's about the skill. What are we going to do with that? So this is the task, the skill that we're asking you to do. Okay, so if you notice, the first 3 are very similar. Describe, explain, and compare those geographic concepts, processes, models, and theories. So you need to be able to do multiple things with each one of these. Then we also need to describe these in a specific context. So that's really having our examples, right? But then we also have to be able to explain the strengths, weaknesses, and limitations of those models. And so that's what we're going to look at as well. So these task verbs, Ms. Lindsley and I are going to keep going over them. These are, you're going to see these task verbs on your FRQs. So when we talk about describe, giving a detailed account, including reasons or causes, you can read that as well as I can. But what we really want you to do is tell us about something, give a word in the picture, give us that description, reference the object that you're seeing. Explain. Here we're going to ask you to give us a detailed account, including reasons or causes, provide information about how or why a relationship, pattern, position, situation, or outcome occurs using evidence or reasoning. But what I was talking to my students about, what we really want is that, what's that geographic relationship? Try and work in your social, economic, political environment, being able to give us examples. That's where we're trying to get you to really kind of expand on it. And then we might ask you to compare. And so this is where my students are like, well, compare means similarities. No, think compare and contrast. We want to see the similarities and differences between 2 or more items. So remember, your FRQ is going to have, one of them will have 2 stimulus materials. And so we are going to probably ask you to compare, contrast those ideas. So we want to look at situations, though, referring to both or all throughout, description, explanation of those similarities and differences. And so what do you see? What are those connections? And then keep going back to those bigger ideas: economics, society, political, environment. So we're going to jump in. Okay, so those are 3. Those task verbs are going to come back up. I promise you, we're going to practice them over the next 2 weeks. We're getting you pumped for that AP test. And so what we want to do, though, is you're going to see this will be my transition slide between ideas. So we're going to think about different things. We're going to pull in different concepts. So we're going to start with environmental determinism. So you see the definition there. And so you're not going to get asked to define something on the AP exam because you're going to be taking these at home. So you're going to want to have access to this. We want to know how you can think about it in describing, explaining, comparing. Okay. So when we talk about it, the view the natural environment has a controlling influence over various aspects of human life, including cultural development. So when you think about that word, maybe you might think about desertification. Okay, and so we look at these dry areas and we talk about that it's, I always tell my students it's determined, right? That controlling influence. So the reality is that land is dry. It controls the fact that I'm not going to grow a ton of crops in these areas. So these are highly arid areas that we're looking at here, taking a look at. You should know some of these regions. We talk about the Sahara. I mean, even think about our Southwest. We take a look at the Mongolia region, take a look through, we got the Rubicali, we take a look through these areas as well, that it's going to make it difficult then to grow crops. And so it's controlling. It also controls our lifestyle. Think about some of the clothing that you wear in those areas. It's driving those factors. Well, how about also driving the factors when we talk about sea level? Like, the reality is that we know that water is, we're warming and waters are rising. And when we build our homes in some of these areas, that there are some things we cannot control, that is dictating kind of how we're going to kind of live. Now, right now in your head, you're probably going, Mrs. Brandt, we know that, yes, but humans can adapt, right? So that would be one of the we would say weaknesses to this theory, right? We would talk about that this would be, if we were talking about comparing and contrasting, because really aren't we setting up this term, possibilism? So it's a response, right, to determinism. We hold that human decision-making, not the environment, is the critical factor in cultural development. So in your head, you should start thinking, okay, so desertification, we know that those are growing. We know that there's really dry areas. So what do we do? Do we just not live there? Well, in some of those things, we can do things such as this. We can irrigate. Now, that has some byproducts as well. If we talk about, and I didn't put a map up here, but we can talk about it. If we talk about the Caspian Sea and the Aral Sea, we know that they are shrinking. And one of the reasons is the rivers that feed into those areas are being pulled away for irrigation purposes. We also could talk about the rising sea level. Well, guess what? What could we do? Couldn't we build our homes on stilts? If we know that we want access to those areas. And so these are some homes on stilts around the world. But I also was thinking a lot about how about in those rising sea levels, how about polders? Who remembers that term? Okay, so polders, think of the North European plain, think about those drained areas, right? So if we didn't drain it, we wouldn't be able to farm on it, right? So it's, how do we use possibilism then? Like, right, the humans then are adapting to that way of life. So I think, one of the questions is, what are some examples of countries that represent environmental possibilism? I would say, I think that within each country, I wouldn't say that I would just say a country by itself, but if you want to take a look at, this is a great example that I have here. This is New Orleans. New Orleans is built on a floodplain. I mean, at the end of the day, it is determined, right, that it will flood. Well, what did humans do in order to control it? We built some levees. We built some flood walls. We built up, so you can see. We've got trying to hold back, right? So you've got the riverbank. We've got trying to hold back those areas. The reality is, though, for a long time it worked really well, but Hurricane Katrina was a prime example of when those levees didn't hold. That at the end of the day, some would argue, go back to compare and contrast, right? That at the end of the day, we can try, but nature, I mean, you built it on a floodplain that if it's strong enough, it will wipe things out. And we saw that happen. But for a long time, people would argue possibilism took hold because we were able to build there, and they're rebuilding again. When countries shift from determinism to possibilism, does that also coincide with development? I think you totally could talk about it, because think about the infrastructure that you have to put in place, and you have to think about the investment. Take a look at this New Orleans map. That is not cheap. Think how much money that they had to spend in order to make this livable. If I go back to the polders, I mean, even that idea of draining that to make it usable, to be able to irrigate, it's going to take, that's part of those investments, right? And then to be able to move those goods in and out of those areas. I even think about like Chicago. We completely changed the direction of the Chicago River because it was the waste that was pouring into Lake Michigan. Or how about the building of the I&M Canal so that we could connect Chicago ultimately with the Mississippi River? The Erie Canal, those canals, that idea of opening up those waterways for transportation. So great questions. So adaptation definitely is an example of possibilism that works as well. So regional analysis. So here you see these terms again. So now we want to look like, what do we mean by regional analysis? How do we describe, explain, compare? And what I'm trying to do is really that 1D. How do we get you into these examples? So here, when we talk about formal regions, so for example, in your head, you should go, okay, formal region, the easiest one, let's be honest, are our political boundaries, right? But they're clearly united by more than one trait. So you look at the continent of Africa here, and you're going to say, clearly united by more than one trait. We can see the countries here, states, sorry. But then I could also say, how about this? Isn't this a formal region? Isn't the Sahara Desert? Does that put limitations on people, where people live, people have access? Does it stop communication? I mean, have you ever noticed that, we use the phrase all the time, south of the Saharan desert, because there's definitely a cultural shift. There's a difference between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. How about this? We could pull out united by more than one trait, people that speak the same language. So in Western Africa here, could this be a formal region? Does that unite that area? Does it leave others out if we start talking scale? And then we could also dive in a little bit deeper, and we take a look at Ghana here, and we talk about the Gold Coast, and we talk about the resources that are available there as well. So formal regions. In contrast, we could talk about functional regions. I don't know why, my students, I swear, they struggle with functional regions like crazy. My son nodded his head just a little bit. It's been 3 years since he had the class, and he's like, yeah. But in my mind, I'm like, this one to me makes the most sense because you live it and you just don't even know it. So defined geographic areas centered around a specific focal point with a specific function. So for example, this is our metro line, so our train lines here in Chicago. So the center point is Chicago, and then we can see all the different lines moving in or out. I mean, this is functional regions. We could look at our traffic patterns, right? Isn't this moving people in and out? This one is one of my favorites. And it's a little bit dated, but I still liked it, so I used it. So WGN is a broadcast, it's a radio station, TV station here in Chicago. And if I say Tom Skilling, people in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan may even know Tom Skilling, as he is the local weatherman on WGN. He's kind of infamous. If you've never heard of him, Google Tom Skilling. He's quite fabulous. But look at the range that WGN is able to broadcast. If you've ever wondered why the Cubs are so popular, besides the fact that they're amazing, it also has to do with WGN's broadcast range. And so that's that functional region because it reaches all of those areas. And so they're able to pull more people in. That range is bigger. But so when we talk about that with functional region, what we're trying to do is how do we connect people? So we're giving some specific examples here. We're describing, explaining. A limitation is if you live outside of that functional region, what if you live, think about here, right on the outskirts of one of these lines? It's going to make it difficult for transportation. Or if you live in between, where are you going to go? Are you going to drive? So those are all things to consider. Probably my favorite, though, is when we talk about vernacular perceptual. So those fuzzy regions, I clearly know what the Midwest is because I would like to say that this is what it is. But look at these different interpretations of these regions. I mean, that's perceptual, vernacular, right? That how we define them is going to be based more on those that are there. We try to have some sort of unifying characteristic. In some of these, they look pretty clear, and some of them they don't. I mean, or they're just combining even more and more together. How come an area dominated by a certain crop is not functional region, but an area served by certain sports franchise? Oh, somebody has had to do a practice FRQ because that is a practice FRQ question. Nice job. So when we talk about crops, though, it's not about the distribution of that, okay? It's kind of, this is what the land can provide. I always like to think of a focal point with functional. Sorry, I'll go back. And it's that range that it's going to circulate. So with a crop, what's the node? Like what would be your function, like the node? And so that's going to be, your crop is going to be more in line with your formal typically because it's going to be that unifying characteristic. Okay, so we did some examples there. And actually, we could actually go back and talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses. I mean, I think when we talk about perceptual vernacular, one of the biggest weaknesses is that it is fuzzy and it makes it really difficult to decide who's in which area. Well, why do we use them? Because they also become very personal. They based very cultural and real. Functional and vernacular can work hand in hand, but they're not the same. So functional, really think about that node. That might be something that overlaps, but I would try and keep them a little separated. So when we talk about migration here, so there are certain patterns that we want to take a look at. You need to be able to describe. So if I say forced, so in your head, you should start thinking about, when we talk about forced, you should start thinking about like refugees, internally displaced persons, slavery. When we talk about voluntary, you should be thinking in your head, chain, step, um, those things that people are doing by choice. But the big thing here with describe is kind of that why, like explaining what happened. And so that describe and explain, and then explain, really pull in some more of those examples. So if I said, so if maybe in number one, I talked about step migration and those stops along the way and how that impacts different areas, and then explain, if I had kind of a same question, maybe I would dive more into kind of the Vietnamese boat people and the process that it took for them to eventually end up in their final destination. When I look at forced migration, being able to know some of those hotspots, there's no way you can memorize all of this, okay? But I would remember too, when we talk forced migration, so we talk about the orange here are conflicts. So be able to, I would say in the back of your head, at least have one conflict that you're pretty comfortable with, or one disaster, because we could take a look at, forced, like Hurricane Katrina that we talked about earlier would be a prime example of a forced migration, how people were forced out of their homes and forced to move inland. But having those specific examples will help you to explain. If we were going to that compare, being able, if I was talking refugee versus internally displaced, that idea of being able to think about the impact on the country that they're leaving, but also the country that they're going to. And so that's where you're going to be able then to talk about some of that being able to compare some of the similarities and differences. Voluntary migration, my students, there's a retired question that they just cannot stand. And so I try to give it to them on a regular basis. No, I'm just kidding. But out of all seriousness, the one that talks about the waves of migration into the United States, those voluntary waves. And then the difference, so describing would talk about maybe the different reasons that people came to the United States, explaining how they came, why they came, the impact that they've had on that area in those different ways. But then the compare could have you comparing those different waves of immigrants. So it could be how they were accepted, which ones assimilated, which ones acculturated, where was it the melting pot, when was it the melting pot, when was it the salad bowl is kind of what I'm going with there. Newer immigrants, so the challenges today, looking at our immigrants from Latin America versus the immigrants, the European immigrants that came, or even taking a look at your immigrants from Latin America versus refugees that are coming as well. But it's not just the United States that are dealing with voluntary migration. And I shouldn't have said that refugees, sorry, that's wrong on my part. Mrs. Brandt, that's a forced migration. But we're also taking a look at, like, Europe has had a huge, influx of, I would say, forced and voluntary migrants. And so when we talk voluntary, a lot of it, I would say, focus on the brain drain. That, think about it, the brightest and the best are the ones that typically are able to leave their country. The problem is they're leaving with, they're the ones that are coming and sometimes not even working in their dream jobs, but they know that this is opportunities for their families. Well, where are they going to go? Well, the reality is North America and Europe are going to be primary destinations because of where they are in terms of development and what they have to offer. They're going to have more jobs, they're going to have more resources, and that's going to be that biggest draw. So I'm not going to break down all of them. One of the questions, can I break down the difference between political and social causes of migration? I would say if you were, though, going to look at stuff, if we were going to talk political, you want to talk about government, a couple of things, either government pressures that are causing migration. And so it could be the type of government, maybe a strict unitary government, it could be laws. You could also take a look at policies then for the receiving countries. How welcoming are they? So are there any quotas in place? Your teachers probably talked to you about, for example, some of the different immigration laws that the United States has had in place over the years. So I guess the openness of those receiving countries. When we talk social migration, typically you're going to talk more cultural, probably chain migration, would be religion, language. So what's going to maybe push you out of some areas, but pull you to certain areas, and then the clustering that will occur. Now that can create some conflict too. That we've seen in places such as France, where there's been a huge influx of guest workers, in particular from Southwest Asia, aka the Middle East, and that's created some cultural divide between the people that live there. So, well, I shouldn't say all live there, but the native French versus then the guest workers as well. Why is there so much voluntary movement in Asia? That's a great question. And so one of the things we see in Asia too, that voluntary movement, remember, they're just huge numbers of people. There's a lot of movement in that Southeast Asia. I mean, and even movement into China, those areas where the factories are really growing. You're going to see people moving towards Indonesia, Shanghai, Singapore, but moving to those choice of looking for jobs a lot of times is what's happening there, those opportunities. And part is it's you can move through so much between those countries, but I wouldn't say it's all happiness. It's looking for an opportunity to put food on the table for your family as well, and that's the resources that they have, being able to move to those areas. So it's not a bad transition to diffusion. So we've did this, feels like forever ago, but we did take a look at different types of diffusion. So being able to describe the concept. So if I said hierarchical, if I said stimulus, if I say relocation, you should be able to describe it, then be able to explain it. And so I would talk about its impact, and then be able to compare and contrast those as well. And so explain, I'd probably have an example that I'd want to work in there. It never hurts to work examples in. And then we want to be able, because that's really what 1D is in specified context as well. So my producer was happy that I did not have the golden arches on this one. And I tried to find a different image for you, because what do we notice when we talk about stimulus, right? So stimulus, we talk about, taking something familiar as McDonald's, but then kind of adapting it to that culture. And so, I'd have to Google which on each one of these sandwiches here. But I guess what I would say is, if I talked about some of the strengths and weaknesses, so being able to talk about stimulus diffusion, the strength is that you are celebrating your local diversity, right? That I'm going to find some of my traditions within here. But the weakness is that it is a little bit of globalization, right? The more you let in those outside ideas and influences, could that start to crush some of your local diversity as well? Hierarchical diffusion, most of your textbooks have something that probably connect to the spread of music. And so we talk about rap, where it originates. If you take a look in the 1980s and you take a look, look at New York City, and then how it's kind of spreading or diffusing throughout the United States. Let's be honest, I am not very familiar with rap music. So part of it's going to be generational, right? Part of it's going to be where I live. I mean, Chicago has a little bit bigger of a circle now. So not my son that's helping today, but my other son really likes it. But so it's going to skip places in between. I think this map does a really nice job of taking a look at of influence. There's also some connection to race from the standpoint of the community in which rap started with. And if we take a look at some of the other bigger circles, if we look at Atlanta, if you look at Detroit, and even 2015, look at Chicago, look at New Orleans, there's definitely going to be a connection, because kind of as a form of expression, but then skipping some of those other areas in between as it spreads. So we gave it an example. And so one of the weaknesses is that, right, it doesn't hit everybody. And so how do you make as much money? And so a lot of times, you know, some of those rappers they have to find ways to cross in. I think Kanye West is a rapper. My son just nodded his head, but I actually know his name probably more because of the Kardashians versus his music. And so how can they cross over? He also has a clothing line that helps him kind of cross over and bridge some of those gaps and kind of to spread. So that could be kind of a limitation if you were talking about that as well. Contagious, I tried to pick, so we definitely think about hitting everything in the path, everything we come in contact with. So I try to pick something different because I don't know about you, I can only talk about COVID-19 or coronavirus so much. So the H1N1, I also picked this because my children were very little when it came, and all three of them had it. We're not allowed to go trick-or-treating. So I point that out because we take a look at this map on May 2nd. Now watch, ready? Take a look by July 2nd. So just look at how quickly that spread, right? And so that idea of coming in contact with people and just how quickly that it spreads. And so being able to have some examples, I mean, the reality is you're welcome to use if Contagious comes up to talk about a modern example. So if you have a lot of information about the coronavirus, go for it. You can use a historical example as well. And then what we take a look at is kind of being able to compare this, think about it where it's hitting everything, to here where, see how it's skipping those places in between. Okay, our last section with this skill is looking at political boundaries. And so we could talk about, you know, why do we talk about political boundaries and we talk about these border disputes? I mean, everybody's got some border disputes, it feels like, around the world. So we talked just on Friday, and I know I was like freezing on funky frames for you guys. I apologize. My computer's about ready to, it's about had it. But out of all seriousness, when we take a look at this, that we see a lot of conflict, and a lot of it comes down to the definition of those boundaries or how they were decided. And so I gave you 4 different ones. Remember, you're not going to have to, and I know that there's others out there, but you're not going to have to be able to define on the spot, but you're going to need some examples. And so maybe you're going to describe a specific border dispute. Now, maybe I want to talk about an antecedent, and I'm going to take a look at the Himalayas, and maybe I take a look at how that creates some ambiguity on where the boundary is. Or maybe I want to talk about, you know, after these different groups meet, and so taking a look at the border between Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh and their faith. And so then we look at the strength is it was designed to separate, but a weakness is that if we dig into the scale, right, is that there are still people of different faiths in those regions. Superimposed, I mean, you better be able to talk to me about the continent of Africa. You better be able to talk to me about how the weaknesses of those superimposed boundaries. You know, the strength is only there as long as that the imposing government remains. The moment that they leave, it creates some problems. We could dig further into the antecedent here and talk about that Himalayan tri-border dispute. You know, who owns this area? We have no defined boundaries in parts of this. You've got taking a look, you know, you can keep digging into it, looking at the Western sector, what they believe it should look like, what the middle sector should look like, you know, how it should be defined creates a lot of political negotiation and tension as well. Okay. So ultimately what we did today is we went through 4 different chapters, and we really talked about these concepts, and we really spent some time describing, we explained, we compared, and we ultimately were even able to look at some strengths and weaknesses. If you haven't picked up from it, this is not a class you can memorize your way through it. You've got to be able to think through it, give examples, kind of talk about lots of different ideas. But what we just did is we pulled that thread and we just connected a bunch of different things. The Indo-Pakistani border, is that superimposed? To some degree, yes. And that's part of the problem, is because, you know, when Great Britain left and how that was defined, and then how we handed those things over to, and in theory, everything sounds really good, but then there are people living there that maybe didn't have a say in those decisions. Okay, so your practice for tonight that Miss Lindsley will go over tomorrow, okay, and this is also taken from College Board. So if we take a look at, you got Europe in 1980 and Europe in 2013, okay, and so you take a look at, you should be looking at where Yugoslavia used to be. Okay, so they've changed considerably. Nationalism and supranationalism were two geographic processes. Okay, so that's where this connects. That processes connects to our skill that change the number and function of those borders. So you're going to say, Mrs. Brand, I thought we weren't going to do identify. It might be something like this. I highly doubt it. If it is letter A, so my guess is Miss Lindsley might skip over that one tomorrow, and just because I don't think that's the type of question you're going to get. I just wanted you to see what used to be there. It could have you identify something that you see on the map, chart, or graph, but they're not going to ask you anything that you can just Google. So B, C, and D are the ones that you probably will get asked. You know, how nationalism can eliminate an international boundary, explain how nationalism can create new international boundaries, and then describe two ways supranationalism has affected the functions of international boundaries. So that's our explain and describe and talking about those processes. So I hope you enjoyed today. And you're starting to see how we're going to keep kind of we're reconnecting, and we're going to keep bringing those ideas, but we're really transitioning to prepping you for those FRQs. You're gonna hit it out of the park. I know it. Your questions have been great, and I appreciate those of you that are helping one another. At this point, I'd like to thank you for watching, and tomorrow you're going to take a look at skill 2. So have a great night, everybody. Try not to binge watch too much Netflix between now and tomorrow, but have a good one. See you tomorrow.